Um, so this hopefully it is one of many sessions. In ACSP, we already do a lot of mentorship, and if you look at all the programs, there's something for everyone, really, from pre doctoral students to also administrators. However, we don't have like anything in where we can come together and just talk about mentorship broadly. And one of the goals of ACSP is related to the strategic plan that was just like adopted at the last conference is goal number 2, which is like cultivating mentorship for growth. And there's like even more that we can be doing for mentorship, which is the reason that we're doing here. We are here. We have like a series of um, just different talks, and we will be announcing those so you can have a lesson of that. But for now, we just announce this one this year. We have like more coming up next year, and the first one was also like born primarily because we're thinking about mid-career faculty members that are going for full, and we thought that this would be a good talk. But of course, there's also people that have joined us today that are students, and or some of them might be thinking about even becoming PhD students in the near future and applying now. So there's all kinds of like people joining us today. So welcome everyone. Just before we get started, I wanted to just like launch this like quick poll, and I hope that people can see it. But basically, it's just saying like who you are. I didn't ask this in the registration, which is like you're a PhD, visiting instructor, postdoc, assistant professor, associate, or already a full professor. And also the second question is like where are you in the writing process, which could be just exploring the idea in the process of it, or you're not working on a book but just curious what this is all about. So let's just do that, because I think that that will really help our speakers to just like be able to talk more to the audience and see who is here. While everybody does that, I'm going to just like introduce the session. Again, there's like still some waiting for people to complete that. Um, so today we have like two speakers, Professor Willow Lung-Amam and Michael Lenz, and they will share how they develop their book projects. So that will go from this, what is the initial idea, to working with like publishers. And also we will have like questions related to how they choose publishers, what forms of supports they have, maybe like editors, indexers, student assistants, or funding that were valuable for that particular project. And hopefully you as a participant will leave with some practical strategies for planning your book and then managing the writing process, and later on promoting your work. So I will introduce our speakers. Willow Lung-Amam is an associate professor at the University of Maryland, College Park. She directs the Small Business Anti-Displacement Network, the Urban Equity Collaborative, and Community Development at the National Center for Smart Growth. She's also the author of 2 books, and the Right to Suburbia, which was published in 2024, and Trespassers in 2017. And her work is on segregation, gentrification, and suburban inequality. And it has, she also writes a lot for just the media, trying to like promote her work and having some impact, which is obviously one of the reasons that many of us aspire to write a book. And Dr. Michael Lenz is a professor of urban planning and public policy at UCLA and chair of the long-scale undergraduate programs. And he's author of Where the Hood At 2024. So again, all these are like very recent books, and we should read them and we should support them. And going back to Dr. Lenz, his research examines zoning, segregation, housing subsidies, and eviction. And his work have appeared also in leading journals and supported by major foundations. So specifically this a book, so we can hear more about that, and also federal agencies. So we are going to have like 5 different blocks. They have the questions. I will also put them in the chat, so we'll have those. And we will have like about 10 minutes per block, I will say. But if we take less time, it might be better, because then we can have some questions at the end. And I'm trying to see if I can, yeah, I can put the questions here in the chat. Hold on. Seems like I'm having a little trouble here because my apologies. I think I'm having a trouble because there's author coming up and interfering. But I think yeah, we will just verbalize the questions then. And I'm going to end the poll because I feel that people that were going to answer them answer them. And so for our speakers, you can see here the percentages. So 17 PhD students. Oh, you have to share the results. My apologies. Now you can see it. 17% PhD students, then 14% visiting structural postdoc, 38% assistant professor, 19 associate, and 12% professor. And how we're doing in terms of thinking about our book project. So 32% exploring an idea, then 41% already drafting a proposal. That's great. And 14% looking for a publisher, never an easy task. Writing chapters, 25%, revising a manuscript, 5%, promoting a book, 5%, and 20% that we are curious about it. And this is the reason that we are here today. So with that, I'm going to stop the results of that and then go to the first block. And the first block is basically deciding on writing a book. And we can start with like Willow, and then go with Michael. And that first block, it has like 4 questions. So which is, what motivated you personally to pursue a book project? What does pursuing a book at the it's really like the difference, right, of pursuing a book as an assistant professor and associate professor, right? Like how you thought about that. How do you compare writing articles to writing a book? And what is it? And here really what we are getting at is the for advice also for people that are at the assistant level and all the associate level, right? And thinking about the difference between writing books and articles, and what suggestions they have for people that wish to then write the book, basically. So let's start with that. And again, the first block is deciding to write that book.
Thank you, Evis, for this generous invitation, and thank you all for being here. This is a great crowd and a great opportunity to share some of my hard-earned lessons, I suppose, from having written 2 books. So, Evis, to clarify, did you want me to go through all the sub-questions under the topic?
So it is kind of like more loose, right? So it's just more like guiding questions. But if you if you want to, that's great, but we want to hear your narrative about what people should be thinking about and what you thought yourself about when you were thinking about deciding to write that book.
Yeah. I think for my first book, it was from my dissertation. So it was definitely a decision that I made early on in my dissertation process that my dissertation was meant to be a book. And so I think a lot of us sort of think about that in the process about are we writing a couple articles or are we writing a book? And I very intentionally wrote my dissertation as a book. That said, I think I didn't know what a book was when I was writing my dissertation. I didn't really understand the difference between a dissertation and a book. And so there was a learning curve that had to happen for me to translate my dissertation into a book. And I think I was very, very lucky, I will say, coming out of my dissertation. When I was in my second to last year while writing the dissertation, I was part of a fellowship group at the University of California, Berkeley, that was about social change scholars. And it was not just a writing group, it was really a thinking group about our careers and our trajectories. And one of my mentors there happened to introduce me. We spent a long time workshopping our work together. She knew I was writing a book, helped me to develop some of the chapters in the dissertation, and then introduced me to a University of California press editor who has produced now both of my books. So what happened in my story is a very unusual story, but she asked at the time they met, they were good friends, and she asked, "Do you know anybody who's a scholar that I should know? A young up and coming scholar that I should know?" And she mentioned my name. And so she put me in touch. I reached out. I said, "I'm developing my dissertation. Here's the topic." She said, "I would love to see your dissertation." And so before even my manuscript was completed, I sent my developing dissertation to a press editor at the University of California Press who said, "I like it. I think it's a great dissertation. I think it would make a great book. And so let me know when you're done, and I'll provide you with some feedback on getting it to a book." And she did, and I did. And then I spent from the time that I graduated in 2013 to 2017 when the book was published, getting it ready for a book. And so her guidance was really, really critical for me in that she talked about we don't need literature reviews, how my methods were too in the way of the story. We talked about story arc and characters and narrative development. And so I learned about telling a good story, really, in the process of working with an editor. She was not super hands-on, she was super hands-off. So towards the latter question, I did get other help, mentors, a content editor, other people to help me along in that process. But I am very glad that I wrote a book. It made me sort of fall in love with the scholarship in a different way. I feel like it just allows a different form of expression as a writer, as a thinker. Um, I'm a community engaged scholar, so I feel like it allows me more nuance, like to tell about a place and a people that I care a lot about. I think in terms of sort of thinking about the article form. I've written tons of articles, but I always kind of feel like a little bit of a loss, like at a loss, like I'm not telling a full story. And it always seems like the 15,000 words or whatever you're allowed is just like part of the story that I want to tell. So I would encourage book writing for those who really like love the art form, right? And think about their scholarly writing as something that could expand through the book writing process. And that sort of ideas about like the fuller narrative um, and telling a bigger story that you think the book format can do. I also think that it allows me as a scholar to present myself a little bit more fully and authentically within the manuscript because I have to be a believable storyteller to be able to tell a story that somebody cares enough to read 300 pages worth. So in every manuscript, I've put my own story, not front and center in the book, but as a part of the story so that people feel invested in me as the narrator of a story that they feel engaged to read. And so I think that has been an incredibly useful journey for me and just learning about my own scholarship. And I just, when I think about as a scholar, the things that have really shaped my own trajectory through the academic world, I can name a lot of books. I cannot name a lot of articles. So I think just in terms of making my mark and sort of having a shelf life, like shelf life literally means a book on a shelf, right? In terms of scholarship that I care about in the world, I think it's very satisfying to write a book. It's very hard to write a book, and we'll talk about that. But I think it's a powerful mark to leave for the field, and a powerful thing to leave for the communities that you work with.
Excellent. So those are like great um just like a great story, right, of like how do you decide it, but a lot of it is like what I heard is that maybe you didn't know what you were getting into, and that's kind of like inevitable, right? In a way, with a book, but it seems like you really learn a lot and you grew, and you it's not only important for your work and the impact of your work, but also for the community. And I think again, that's like very a big motivator for people that want to see that impact and tell the story of the communities that they work in. But well, let's hear like from Michael about like that decision of like what motivated you to just write your book.
Yeah, thanks, Evis. Thanks for the invitation, and it's really exciting to have such a big crowd here. Yeah, I think there's a really interesting contrast with Willow's story and kind of experience. I think I came to a lot of very similar conclusions and kind of thoughts on the process and the outcome and all that. But you know, Willow Willow started this as a dissertation project, right? Or at least her first book, and my arc was very different. So, my dissertation was, I'm purely a quantitative researcher, and I think there's a conversation that we can have about like, kind of what field you're really in and how your field or subfield like values books versus journal articles. And so when I got my start, I was more on the kind of applied economist, public policy analysis side of things where, journal articles are the most obvious currency or the most obvious way you're going to express your scholarship. And so that was my dissertation project was really, conceived of as like three empirical articles with some, literature review and stuff around it. And then, almost my entire pre-tenure and even a little bit post-tenure arc was all just a series of journal articles, right? Like I was never really thinking about a book project as a necessity, and I wasn't thinking about it as like the main way that I would likely ever be evaluated as a scholar or thought of. And, I was a segregation researcher in addition to thinking about housing affordability as my kind of two main, areas. And there are a fair amount of like segregation books. And at some point, I was looking for data on Black neighborhoods in this country over a time period, and it just became very obvious to me that nobody had really kind of collected that information, um, presented that information in a comprehensive way. And I thought, okay, well, this is something that I want to have like for teaching purposes, and I want to have at my disposal for, testing some hypotheses about what might affect Black neighborhoods for better or worse. And then once kind of thought about like, where I felt like I identified a gap. I identified a hole that was bigger than a journal article. It was really kind of that simple, where the more I thought about the lack of information on this kind of unit of analysis that I was really interested in, the more I figured that telling a story about this isn't, something that you would describe in a journal article. It's something that you would really like dig into, in part because there's a big country and there's 50, 60 years of data that I was interested in mining through. So, again, in contrast to Willow, like this came much later in my career. I probably had tenure for a year or two before I even started exploring this. Yeah, at least 2 years probably before I even started exploring this. And, I think speeding ahead a little bit to like what that process became for me, um, you know, I think echoing some of what Willow said is you can really discuss things that are of deep interest to you and you hope are of deep interest to the academy in a much more nuanced way. Like one thing that became kind of apparent to me during this process that maybe should have been obvious is like in a journal article, you kind of have to prove almost every assertion you make, right? You have to like cite it, or you have to prove it with data, or prove it with, some information that you gleaned in your field, in the field that you might have been doing research in. And like in a book, you can float some hypotheses and really just work through them. And I found that process to be very, very interesting, and kind of almost removed some constraints, in ways that really kind of allowed me to explore things. I think, you know, um, a lot of why I ended up doing this at the time I ended up doing it certainly has to do with the fact that I was tenured, and like I think there were two areas of risk that were no longer risky for me, or they were no longer that salient. One, there's the risk of like, what if this big project that you pour all of your, time into doesn't really pan out? And I just wasn't as worried about that as I would have been, 5 years earlier before tenure. And then the other thing is, I think, Willow got to talking about this a little bit, which was like expressing yourself as more fully as a scholar. I think, for this audience in particular, like before I was tenured, like I was a little bit like concerned about being a Black scholar who studies Black things and like getting kind of stereotyped in that way. And so I tried to take care to study my field a little bit more, I don't know, holistically, or
Mhm.
not always focusing just on race. And so after tenure, I was like, I don't really care anymore. Like I'm just gonna study this thing and it's of interest to me. And if it's not of interest to like, the old white people in my field, like that's fine. And so, I think you do have to kind of balance risk and think about that. And of course, risk is a little bit less salient after you're tenured.
Right. Excellent. I really love everything that you said, but especially it was like identifying that like research gap that you were like looking for books and nobody has done that work of putting it together for teaching purposes. Because I feel that that could be a great motivator for sure, besides all the things that we have talked about, of course. So for the next set of questions, I think that Willow already answered some of these, right? Because she talked about how actually somebody was kind of like a matchmaker, right, to make that connection with like the publisher. But maybe I'm thinking it's like after that happened, like can you tell us more about the proposal writing process of how actually did you get that contract, and then also um in the proposal many times it's about like, what is your platform, and those kinds of questions. So I'm wondering if you can also talk about that as well.
Yeah, so I'll be honest, for the first book, I did not even submit a proposal. So I did not know what a book proposal looked like because my editor never asked me for one. She read my dissertation, she asked me to revise it and to send her back the manuscript when it was completed. And I did. And when I sent her back the manuscript when it was completed, she sent it out for review. So I never completed a book proposal for my first book. She's a senior editor with her own series who has been at the University of California Press forever. And I think she could get away with that. I don't know how many editors could. So I think, again, I was very lucky. However, for my second book, I did submit a proposal, not just to the University of California Press, but to, I think, six other presses. So I developed a proposal. I sent it out to a number of different editors, including my editor at California Press, and then got some feedback and had some conversations with editors before I decided to go with my editor again at the University of California Press. So for that, this was my second book. I had already had, it took me a long time to write the second book because I was completing the first book. So the first book was my dissertation. I got on the tenure track. I started, I did a year postdoc where I was finished, where I was working on the manuscript, but it still took me another 2 or 3 years on the tenure track to finish those revisions and then send it out. And it was at least a year process of going back and forth with reviews and things like that before the final book was published. So in the midst of all that, I was starting my second book. I began the research. I got some grants to do the research, probably really beginning in about 2015 was when that work really began. I wrote several articles because, again, we're all like producing articles while we're trying to get a book out. I was still on the tenure track, even though I had my book. And I will say, based upon Michael's comments, like some of my mentors told me not to write even my first book, let alone my second book, because they're like, you don't know if you're going to get this out on time. You don't need a book. You've done articles, just keep doing them. And I was like, no, this is the kind of scholar and writer and thinker I want to be. I'm going to write the book. So I kind of did double duty in terms of like reaching my numbers in terms of the expectations for article output and writing a book. But that was also just like this, it was a stamp for me that this is the kind of work that I want to do, but I couldn't rely on it, if you will, for my tenure because I wasn't sure like how long it was going to take, and I just wanted to be foolproof. So that was my strategy, not one that I would totally suggest because it was a very painful few years on the tenure track. But for my second book, I started the proposal writing process after I had sort of figured out my whole approach. I had written and done some research in each of these areas. I had done like shortened versions of articles that were helping me think through what my chapters were going to look like. And then I approached editors that I had been introduced to. So every editor that I approached, I had either an introduction from somebody else, or I knew them personally from having met them at conferences or being introduced to them in some other sphere. So that's one thing that I would suggest, because an editor is a relationship. And just going in coldly to an editor, you might get a good response and they might be really excited about your work, but it's probably better if you've spoken to them at a conference or you've had an email exchange before where you told them a little bit about your manuscript and they're excited about it. Because editors are just people who like to read, right? And if they are people who want to read things that are really, really fascinating to them, and who they like you as a writer. So you're going to get the best response from somebody who you have a great conversation with, and they're interested in your topic. And they're interested in how you approach your scholarship, right? Like I've most of my editors that I talk to are historians or people in sociology, people who like the narrative form. My guess is that Michael has a different set of editors that are really interested in his work, because most of mine don't produce like more quantitative scholarship work. Like, so you need to know who your editor is and what they like. So I had relationships with each of them. I sent off, I developed my proposal, had several people read over it. And then I had some conversations with folks. And so I did get some positive responses. Some people were like, let me know when your 3 chapters are done, which are like this kind of the minimum threshold for folks that you don't really have much of a relationship with. But there were some that didn't ask me for those chapters as well, because they knew me. They had also written a first book. And so the first book was kind of testament that I could write a second book. So if I'm going to suggest that your first book, most of the editors are going to ask for those 3 chapters, but with your second book, you might be able to get away with not sending those 3 chapters in advance before a contract. So I ended up going with the University of California Press because of the type of editor that I was looking for and the type of publisher that I was looking for. The thing that I really appreciated about University of California Press was that my editor was well known in the urban sociology space, and that is an area where I feel like my work really sits well within. And so it will show up at Urban Affairs and I think ACSP. But I'm always at the sociology conferences or even like American Studies and all these other venues that I think my book actually does really well in. So part of it was about the audience of the University of California Press. The other thing was just the kind of editor that I wanted to work with. And then I realized in working with my editor the first time, she's not really super hands-on, but she's a cheerleader of the work, and she has a lot of cachet within the press to push a book that she wants to see to publication. And that's what mattered to me. What mattered to me was that I got the book out, that I had somebody who could savvily navigate the process, and that she really, really loved the book and would give me feedback that was about how to make the book just better, like in very broad strokes, like as a seasoned editor, but not like sort of controlling the manuscript. Because I've heard from other people that have had publishers that have stopped them in the process, have really controlled the process, and just weren't as supportive as I feel like my editor was. So when I get together with my editor, she wants to talk about like all things happening in the world. And then she wants to like really know what's motivating me in the moment. She's like very much a human interest person. And I love that about her. And I think that it helped in the way that I saw her as in the way that she helped to shape my manuscript. She also cared a lot about like covers and titles and like how to sell the book, and that those were areas that I thought I needed help in. And so I thought those were helpful qualities of an editor that really helped in my process.
Hi, thank you so much, Willow. And how about you, Michael? Like, how do you go about developing and submitting your proposal?
Yeah, so I had a bit of I had a very different experience with my book, in that, so the Russell Sage Foundation about 6 years ago, um, started a pipeline scholars program, which was explicitly trying to like get a new, I don't know, generation of scholars that work on issues of inequality and race, into their fold. And so this this grant program didn't provide a ton of money. I think, my so what I applied for that pipeline scholars program. I think I was in the first cohort. This was like a little bit before COVID. And that got me, I applied for like a $50,000 grant, got it. Um, and it's a bit of an odd duck, that grant program, in that it like actually gives the foundation the right of first refusal on any book that is produced as a result of that grant. And like I explicitly, applied to them with this book idea. Um, and so that was a tension at first, where I was like, I didn't know if, once I found that out, I didn't know if I wanted to accept that money, because it, shoehorned me into an arrangement with that publisher, and I didn't know, like, would this advantage me, disadvantage me? Um, Speeding ahead to now, I mean, I think in retrospect, that was all to the good for me. I guess because, like, Russell Sage is certainly, I guess it's not as, elite as some of the, top university presses, but it's, I think well known enough, well regarded enough, like the, community of scholars that produces books through Russell Sage are certainly, very well known, more well known than me. And so like that ended up not being an issue. And also it's a foundation that has a lot of experience producing books on topics that I write about, and on topics that I think a lot of, people on this call write about. And so the fit ended up being very good. Um, what it and what it meant for me in terms of process is, in a way, like my initial very kind of perfunctory proposal ended up being a bit of a book proposal in a way, or at least a proof of concept that like this is something that I, want to do. And that kind of, and I talked to the editor a number of times to get some reassurances, like, how do I know that you all will be interested in actually, turning this into a book? And I got enough good signals from her that like I felt pretty comfortable, continuing to go along their path. Um, and I don't have a good comparison because I haven't, worked with other publishers, but the people they got to review my manuscripts, like my first like draft of the manuscript, 3 or 4 years later after I, got the initial grant, were, pretty much the perfect people to read my work. And I think that was as important as any step along the way for me. Like the fact that I had feedback. I mean, I don't know by name every person that did it. I know by name at least one, and I, think I know who reviewers 2 and 3 were, but I don't know for sure. But um, that was so instrumental in turning this book, in my view, into from something that was, really didn't have a great like narrative, to one that, finally found one, or at least found a narrative. So I think the review process for me, and I'm maybe kind of skipping ahead to the next block, but like the review process was so valuable for me, and the fact that that editor was able to get really the right people meant a ton. So it started from feeling like I was kind of shackled into a relationship with someone who didn't really fund me like a ton of money, right? It was, you know, 40,000, 50,000, something like that. Um, to like feeling like I had, a fairly ideal relationship with an editor and a publisher. So yeah, that turned out very well for me, but it's a different experience certainly than going with a university press or a Rutledge or anything like that, I think.
Yeah, so we already kind of got into some of the next questions, but it's really about completing the manuscript. Um, s- and here maybe it's like to help us think about what are some resources that people might need, that they might need funding for. I know that Willow, you mentioned also that you have like some funding, and we already know that Michael had it with like, the Rosa Sage Foundation. But can you talk a little bit more about the process of like, completing the manuscript and the things that you might have need, including like also how you balance the other demands that you have with actually finishing the books. And I think you already talked about this a little bit, but
Yeah, everything on your list, I gained resources for hiring an editor for my first book, a content editor, not a line editor. The press did line editing for the final manuscript. An indexer, I negotiated that with the press and tons of student assistance throughout both books. I started writing grants for my second book, I think my first year into the tenure track. So I had an idea of what it was going to be. And so I started then, I think before I finished, there's probably 10 plus grants and lots of startup funds and lots of grants from my college that helped to support students along the way, that helped with research. And then on the back end, that helped with getting permissions for photos, helping to produce maps, helping to read through my bibliography and check my citations. So there was lots of student labor along the way. I think the most helpful thing that I did was to hire a content editor, someone to help me think about the story arc, think about the chapter order. She was really into chapter orders, and I was like, I have my chapter order, right? Like I figured out but she's like, if you put chapter 2 before chapter 3, your whole story changes. And so we had really fascinating discussions about chapter order, titles of my chapters. And so she was just like fat, and she was a fabulous writer herself. So someone who I really respect as a scholar, helping me to develop my own manuscript was just fabulously ideal. And so that was probably the most help that I received, and was well worth any amount of money. And she's now like a friend and confidant. Like I can call her for any number of things. So that I would suggest looking into, because most people are concerned with the line editing and making sure that the manuscript is fine, but the content editor to me is far more valuable of how are you telling your story. She helped to develop like me to think about like character and setting and narrative and arc and all these things that I already talked about. And to the last question about balancing the long-term demands, it's just like fabulously difficult, right? At any stage, not just at the assistant professor stage where you're doing all the things, and still like learning who you are as a scholar and teaching and all these other things. But even at the associate professor level, now I've got 3 director titles. I run a national network. Like I am excessively busy. So just like I missed multiple um deadlines for my book because I just like it just takes a long time. If you think about revising one article, when you have 4 or 5 reviewers, imagine revising 6 articles at the same time with 4 or 5 reviewers, which is what I had to do for my second book. And none of the changes were huge, but they all had a big impact. And so if I made a revision in chapter 1, it it made changes. I made changes to all the chapters because I made that one change in chapter 1. And so it was just a really, really long period of time that it took just because I had so many other things. But protect your writing time. My sabbatical post tenure was incredibly important for getting my second book out. Um, but just know that it just takes a really, really long time, and you have to carve out time for your writing. It will never show up in your schedule unless you put it there.
All
Yeah,
right, Michael.
yeah, I mean, that's exactly where I would pick up, specifically, I didn't really start this project in earnest until I went on sabbatical in the fall of 2021. And so I had an entire year of sabbatical. And that was, administratively the right timing, that everybody's got different arrangements with their universities in terms of sabbatical. And at UCLA, that was the point at which I came up where I could have, full pay for a full year. Um, and, I think to me, like the starting of the real work of, you know, getting, making sure that like what my research assistant was doing data wise was like what I needed them to do, and me taking that information and being iterative with them and like really starting to frame a narrative around some of the data. Like it was that starting that kind of startup cost that I think was the best time to have a sabbatical to write it, to really really write. I mean, but I could see it working as well if you were already like fairly into the project and then took a sabbatical to finish it, or somewhere in the middle. Like I don't know what the best thing is, but for me, the idea of like really getting that thing off the ground without a sabbatical is very hard to imagine, especially like as much administrative kind of service stuff I was doing at that time. So I think carving out time, however that works, is so so important. I think I thought of this project as something that would be kind of a hobby that I would kind of dip in and out of sometimes, the way that you might dip in and out of a journal article sometimes, but I think the nature of a book is you have to have your brain consumed by it. Um, I don't, at least in my experience, I don't know how you write, how you really, really interrogate something that deeply without being kind of constantly thinking about it in the shower or like when you're driving or whatever. Like if you think you're just gonna dabble with it or like kind of push it along at the same kind of cadence that you push along an article, you might not get there. I'm not saying it's impossible, but you might not. So it does have to be kind of the number one and number two thing that you're most paying attention to, I think. Um, I'll also I think it's also maybe useful to note. I mean, I feel like there are different ways to do this though. Like, and I think Willow and I, if I understand Willow's processes in these two books, like I think Willow and I are a contrast. She sounds much more organized, much more deliberate. It sounds like she, had relationships with more people to help her along, and that she cultivated those relationships in a better way and got funding to do things that I just kind of did myself, like in an ad hoc way. And so I've always worried, that like I guess that reflects probably more of my processes in life and in work, like where I just kind of, muddle my way through a little bit more rather than having some kind of grand plan of how I'm going to get something done. Um, and in this case, I think it kind of worked for me. I don't necessarily recommend it, but if you're feeling like you can only accomplish something like this by being hyper organized, maybe no. Maybe it's fine if you're not.
All right, you give us some hope. So the last question here, I guess before wrap up, is like, how did you promote your book once it was published?
So for me, I think I did a much better job on my first book than I did on my second. First book, I was pre-tenure, so it was not just the book they wanted reviews of the book, right? They wanted to see me out there um, promoting the book. And so I think I did a better job of being on social, which I don't do much anymore. Whenever I was going to a conference or to any talk, I usually contacted people I knew in surrounding schools and said, I'm coming to the area. If you want me to give a book talk, I'm happy to do so. So that I was already like, I wasn't asking them, maybe they're giving me something to like, or just allowing me to come, right? Rather than waiting for an invitation. I like invited myself, if you will, to some schools. I made sure that anybody who was cited extensively in the work that I sent them, a note to just say thank you for helping me to inspire this book. So they knew that it was out there and available. I contacted local bookstores and offered to come talk. Um, I didn't do this for the first book, but for the second book, I had articles that I authored in both Brookings Institution, where I have a affiliation, and in Next City, that was just excerpts of the book, and contacted local reporters that I knew just to let them know that the book was out there, and if they wanted to cover it, that be happy to. So those are some of the strategies that I've used. I know people that have hired people to promote the book. I've never done anything like that. It's all been organic. But I would say in my first book, I was a little bit more intentional to Michael's point of like having all my ducks in a row. This one, I'm just like, I'm too busy to be intentional. It'll be what it is in the world. But I do think I could be doing more to promote.
Yeah, all that makes sense to me. I Yeah, I mean, I don't do anything social media wise really anymore. And so, there's with the occasional, aside from the occasional like LinkedIn sort of thing, I haven't really been intentional about that. But I like the phrase like inviting yourself. I've invited myself a lot. And it's been, pretty successful. I think by this point, I'm fortunate to have a good network, mostly through ACSB, a couple other associations like UAA and the Association of Public Policy and Management would be the other two um, places where I've cultivated enough people that I can, reach out to people at Berkeley or UNC or, Irvine or, whatever, if it's like semi-local or like around the country. Um, I feel like I've been able to get enough book talks in enough places to certainly match my appetite because I don't really want to spend I love doing it. It's really fun. And I think an important part of this certainly is getting to a talk that you really enjoy giving, because a lot of us have gotten to the end of projects where we're like, I don't want to talk about that ever again. And fortunately, I do want to talk about my project. Um, and but I also have a calendar and a family, and that is, too loaded, or a calendar that's too loaded. And so like I feel like I've been able to get enough exposure through that. And I guess my press certainly isn't very good at telling me like how many books I'm selling and to whom and where. Like there's not a huge marketing arm there. I haven't taken advantage enough of their actual PR people. And so I could do a much better job of that. Um, but those were usually focused on like media, which is focused on kind of exposing the book to like a broad audience. And honestly, my priority was I just want, like, I think what how Willow framed it early on was kind of my thinking, which is I want this to have a shelf life. I want this to have, some influence in the academy in ways that, my articles probably won't. And so I would rather like, 20 people in our field read the book than, 2,000 people buy it, I guess. And so I've been kind of focusing on telling my story to as many audiences as I can.
All right. Well, we're like out of time and we didn't get to all of our questions. This showed me that we also need to do these ones a little bit longer. So next time people can have questions as well, maybe like an hour and a half. But for now, like since people, I wonder if it's okay if people do have questions, you can email Michael or Willow. If you can put the emails on the chat, I think that will be a way to reach you. But thank you very much for your time and for telling your stories, and of course for always being willing to mentor others in ACSP. We have like a next talk already scheduled, and this one it's not really like a talk. It's more of a workshop, and it's 3 hours. So hopefully 3 hours is enough. But it's to encourage people to write, and it's like thinking more deeply about writing. It's with a writing coach, Dr. Michelle Boyd. She has a company in Well Academic Writing Retreats, and she's doing this, free of charge for ACSP, and it's February 20th from noon to 3 p.m. CST, and the registration is right there. So again, just take a time to thank our speakers with thumbs up, hearts, and all that. Get their emails and also register for the next one. Thank you very much, especially our speakers. Thanks.
Cool. Thanks, y'all.
Bye.